we look at Galatians chapter 2, verses 15 through 21. We are interacting with Douglas Moo and some of his assertions in the Baker Exegetical Commentary on the New Testament. And this passage is crucial for us to understand the truth of the gospel. First things first, we really do need to understand verses 11 through 14 of chapter 2 before we dive into the text at hand. Paul is referring back to an incident that took place in Antioch with Peter, where Peter removed himself from fellowship with Gentiles after pressure from James. And that was confusing to everyone and created a rift and dissension, a question, if you will, in Antioch. And Paul opposes Peter and says, in the midst of this, the racial issue here is a big issue. And if you withhold relationship, trying to make Gentiles become more like Jews again, we're creating a rift and we are misunderstanding what we say the gospel is all about. So Paul confronts, of course, and rightly so. And this becomes actually the debate in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15 eventually, where they need to take a stand. What is the expectation for a Gentile in the church? And they come to a great understanding and answer to that question. But it brings up this point. Paul says here we don't want to violate the truth of the gospel. And verses 15 through 21 seek to define what is the truth of the gospel. The first thing that Paul says in verse 15 is, we who are Jews by birth are different than Gentile sinners. And we don't want to make too much of that statement, but I do want to say this. There are distinctions between Jews and Gentiles. We'll unpack or look at those as we go, but as we look through the other portions of the New Testament, racial distinctions or cultural distinctions or gender distinctions don't go away. They are made subservient to our high identity and belonging to Jesus Christ. And that is true to this day. Male or female, Jew or Greek, rich or poor, we can have unity in the church if all of us hold to Jesus Christ as our highest form of identity first. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. Here in Galatians 2:15 and 16, the first thing that Paul does is emphasize that salvation, or that justification, does not come through works of the law. No one is justified by doing the law. He's emphasizing that Jew and Gentile are in the same boat based on the law. The law can save none of us, and doing the works of the law cannot save. Jews and Gentiles are all sinners. And while he makes the case in verse 15 that Gentiles are sinners, he makes the case in verse 14 that Jews can be hypocrites. And so, in essence, he's saying we're all he's making the case that we are all on the same page. We're all sinners, and we are not justified by works of the law. He says it 3 times in verse 16. No people are justified. And he's saying if there's an advantage in being a Jew, it's that we already know this. We can look back at the Old Testament that came through Jewish means and see example upon example that the works of the law do not justify us and are not there. They're not put forth to justify. 6 times in the book of Galatians, the works of the law is a phrase used to help us understand every time, not by works of law is anyone justified. So mankind is all in the same boat. There is no one justified by the works of the law. The era of the law is over. And so there is an appeal here to salvation history. We are in a new time frame after the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But the works of the law, all human flesh, are in the same boat. It's not by works of law that we are saved. And so then he gets to the question, well, then how? How are we saved? Justification is by faith alone in Christ Jesus alone. Yet we know that a person is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. And we pick up this question, is that an objective genitive or a subjective genitive? An objective genitive would leave us and would be typical with Paul's statements and also line up with his use of the Old Testament texts, Genesis 15:6 and Habakkuk 2:4. The objective would indicate faith in Jesus Christ. But in the text here, there's also reasons to think and to go with the subjective, meaning the faith or faithfulness of Jesus Christ. And while I believe that certainly his examples that he points to are all about faith in Jesus Christ, as far as his Old Testament examples, I do think that the passage here is emphasizing that it is not the works of the law, but the faithfulness of Jesus Christ that is our grounds for being justified and declared righteous before God. And so I do think there's a good case that can be made for the subjective genitive. And not only Moo, but if we look certainly in the writings of some of our other Sanders, certainly we've read also N.T. Wright, the faithfulness of Jesus Christ is assumed. So the subjective genitive is assumed. And I think a good case in this place could be made for that. We fully rely on the promises, the work, the person of Jesus Christ alone. So it's not based on the works of law. And I'll just say this. He then goes on to say, if we turn back to the law, we're just going to rebuild the old system. If we just make this about moral change, we're going to take away the power of living in Christ. So with that in mind, we can't rebuild the old system. That's not the way we're going to have real life. And then he goes on to talk about the fact that we are one with Christ. The natural objection is, if the law does not save us and we are free from the law, then aren't we going to divulge, aren't we going to digress into looking just like the world around us? And he's saying, look, the bigger picture here is that as we are declared righteous by God, we enter into union with Christ. And he says it this way, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God. And so there's many, if we had more time, we would unpack this tremendously, but I love what Moo emphasizes here, that we are made one with Christ. And not having the law is not going to sort of be these training wheels that fall off and now we're going to return to this life of lawlessness. No, we are made one with Christ. We are one with him. And in being one with him, we love him. The Spirit lives in us. And so he says here, the Son of God, not a phrase he uses often, he loves me and he gave himself up for me. And Paul puts it in the first person singular. He loves me and gave himself up for me. Look at the love. And how could anyone who has had Jesus love him like that turn back and to the law, to the old way? The law, all through the Old Testament, was not looked to something that could save. It was looking ahead by faith to the Messiah, and therefore none of us are ever justified by works of the law. And all of us, Jew and Gentile alike, are made righteous by faith in Jesus Christ alone, just like Abraham, just like the writings of Habakkuk into today. Now that Jesus has come, we cannot return to any old system. He is alive, and we are one with him.